Hello, everyone, and welcome again. It's Tuesday, and it's time for some fiscal talk. My name is Milica, and I'm a marketing manager at company Fiscal Solutions. And of course, I'm your host today as well. Also, I'm not alone this time. Stefan Ditrih, my dear colleague, is with us, and he will continue giving us some answers on the topic that we started in the previous episode, and that is Norway. Stefan, hi, hello. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, Militz. I think you gave me a great introduction. We are back at it again this Tuesday with a new fiscal talk and the continuation of our exploration of Norwegian fiscalization. So I'm very excited to explore the Norwegian fiscalization more. Last week, we had a general overview of the fiscalization system in Norway. And this week, and hopefully in the next episode too, we'll go into a little bit more details regarding some specifics of the Norwegian fiscal system.
Yes, that's right. That's something that I wanted to mention. So in the previous episode, we were talking about the fiscalization system in Norway in general, and you gave us some answers around e-receipts, online sales, what type of fiscalization is used in Norway, and maybe we did like a short comparison with the Swedish fiscal law, but just short part. And today I would like to cover one interesting topic and really important when it comes to fiscalization, and that is types of fiscal transactions that are in Norway present. So please, the stage is all yours. I don't want to interrupt you.
Okay, Betsy, thank you. When it comes to the types of fiscal transactions in Norway, we have a somewhat specific situation where we have the mandatory transactions described by law and the technical documentation, and then we have optional transactions that are not described by law, but they have to follow some specific rules, meaning that if you're going to use a certain transaction in your POS system, you have to describe it. And when you're declaring your POS system with the tax authority, because every POS system has to be reported to the tax authority, you have to describe every functionality of the POS system you're going to use. But for today, I think it will be enough to focus on the main types of transactions in Norway or the fiscal transactions that are prescribed by law, and every system has to support them. They are the minimum functionalities every POS system has to have. So we're going to start with the most important one, which will be the sales transaction. Of course, one thing to note is that every type of transaction has to be named on the printout or in the e-receipt, for example. So if you're doing a sales transaction, you have to have the words sales receipt printed on the receipt itself, and that the name of the transaction has to be 50% larger in font than other text on the receipt. What is also specific for Norway is that you can use in all the documents, including the receipts, reports, manuals, system manuals, and supporting documentation, you can use 4 languages. You can use Norwegian, English, Danish, and Swedish. But when you're naming your transactions, the name has to be in Norwegian. I don't speak Norwegian. I'm not even going to try to pronounce how it's said in Norwegian, but the name of every transaction has to be in Norwegian, although the rest of the text in the receipt can be in either English, Swedish, or Danish, or of course Norwegian. So if you're issuing a regular receipt, it will be called sales receipt. If you're issuing an e-receipt, it will be called the electronic sales receipt. And as mentioned, that name has to be displayed on the receipt itself. When it comes to the elements of the sales receipt, Norway is not a regulation-heavy country, so we don't have a lot of elements in our sales receipt. A lot of mandatory elements, of course. You can add different elements in a non-fiscal part of the receipt. You can add free text, commercials, and so on, promotions, loyalty points. But when it comes to the fiscal part, our mandatory elements are number of the transaction and the date of the transaction. Date has the actual date and time, and we have data on the seller in the header of the receipt. Of course, we have to have articles or items or services that are being provided and their price. So we'll have article description and price, total price together with VAT, and we also have to have a VAT breakdown per VAT group for that specific transaction. Payment media is also mandatory to be present on the receipt, as well as the POS ID. So that is roughly 8 mandatory elements that have to be present on every receipt, which puts Norway among the countries with the fewest mandatory elements that have to be present on the receipt. I mentioned in the previous episode of our Fiscal Talk that every transaction has to be digitally signed. However, you do not have to print that signature on the receipt, and there is also no QR code on the receipt that is mandatory to display some of the fiscal features of the sales transaction itself. But all of that data has to be saved in the system, in the electronic journal. So we have different elements that are actually printed or present on the receipt, and different elements that are saved in the electronic journal. So moving on from sales, something connected to sales transactions will be the return transaction. So when it comes to returns, there are no specific limitations. In Norway, they take customer protection very seriously. So the return receipt has the same elements as the sales receipt, and usually returns are processed on a separate receipt, meaning that if you're returning an item and getting a new item in exchange, those transactions will be processed on 2 different receipts. So return of the previous item and sale of the new item will be on 2 receipts. That's something that we also don't see everywhere, but the Norwegian legislation also gives you an option to include the return transaction on the same receipt as the sales receipt. As I mentioned, when talking about sales receipt, you have to name each transaction. So if you're combining return and sales, you'll have to write the name of the receipt as sales and return transaction. Also, the only situation where you can combine return and sales on the one receipt is if your system has the ability to count sales receipt and return receipts separately, even though they are physically together on the same receipt. I know it sounds a little bit confusing, but this is important because in the electronic journal, you will save this data separately. So you will count each sales receipt separately from return receipts. So if your POS has the ability to count them separately, you can use just one receipt. If, for example, that's too complex for your POS system, it is very common to issue 2 receipts, one for return, one for sale. Also, an additional element that will be present on return receipts only in case of refunds. So if you're returning an item and you don't want another item in return, you just want your money back, you want a refund. In that case, the refund receipt will have 2 additional elements. It will have the customer's signature and the customer's phone number, which are also mandatory by law. So we have a specific situation in terms of registering sales and return transaction because they have to be counted separately. Later on, they will be present on at the end of the day report as separate transaction. That is why, because end of day reports are mandatory in Norway, it is important to count them separately. Also, something that is also specific for Norway is the copies of receipts. The system can provide only 1 copy per transaction, and that's very explicit in the law. So the system cannot allow for more than 1 copy. So if you want to issue a copy of sales receipt, you can only do it once, and the system has to disable that function after 1 copy has been produced. If your system can produce more than 1 copy, you are in breach of fiscalization requirements and you can be fined. So that's something that you need to pay attention to, especially if you're coming from a country that doesn't have a limit on copy receipts. Also important is that if you're, for example, training new staff, training new employees, all training transactions also have to be saved in the electronic journal separately, and they will be shown on the end of day reports as a separate transaction, so they will also be counted separately from other transactions. And now that I mentioned reports, we have two reports that are mandatory in Norway: end of day or set report and X report. So the set report is mandatory to be created every day as the last transaction of the day. So it closes out the daily turnover, and you cannot process any more transactions once the set report has been created. All the transactions processed after the creation of the set report will go into the next day. They will be counted towards the next day, not in the previous day, because once created, the set report cannot be changed anymore. And also specific for Norway is that both set and X report, they have the same mandatory element. They are pretty detailed, so they will contain all the details on your turnover, every transaction you had, sales, return transactions, how many canceled receipts, how many training receipts, so how many times you opened and closed the cash drawer. So it's pretty detailed and includes the entire usage of your POS system during that specific day. X reports are not mandatory to be created every day, but in case of an audit, an auditor may ask for you to provide X report. In that case, you still have to have that functionality on your POS system, although that is not mandatory. They're not mandatory to be created every day. In contrast, set reports have to be the last transaction of each single day. So that would be, let's say, in general, our main transactions that are described by law.
Great, thank you. So, my next question, I wanted to ask you, like, are there some additional transactions our viewers should know about? But it seems to me like you covered everything. I'm not sure.
Oh well, yes. There's always more. We know that
Okay,
when it comes to fiscalization, you're
please.
never quite there. There's always something else lurking around the corner. Uh, what maybe I didn't mention before, and it's also important for our viewers to know, is that, for example, initial float has to be registered every day, or if you have workers working in two shifts, for example, for each cash register operator, there needs to be a registered initial float. So that is also mandatory to, if you're using initial float, if you have it. If you don't have it, you're not going to register anything. But if you operate a business where you need initial float, you will have to register it at the beginning of each shift, and that will be also saved in the electronic journal. Also, it's something that can be important if you're issuing vouchers or gift cards. As we know, Norway is not in the European Union. That's why the EU rules on vouchers or gift cards do not apply there. So in Norway, we don't have the distinction between single purpose and multi purpose vouchers. We only have something that we can call multi purpose vouchers. In that case, when you're issuing a multi purpose voucher, you will initiate a pay in transaction. That is not a fiscal transaction. However, you can process it through your POS. So you're not obligated to. If you're not processing pay-in and payout transactions, there are rules how to process them manually. But if you want to process them through your system, then that will also be one of functionalities that you have to include in your POS system, and you have to describe when submitting a declaration of conformity to the Norwegian tax authority. So that will be useful for you if, for example, you're issuing gift cards. If not, maybe that transaction will not be needed, but pay in payout can be used in different scenarios, not just for gift cards. So I think, Milica, that covers most scenarios, most in-store scenarios. But of course, depending on the type of your business, you can have more transactions added to your POS system. Of course, if you want to know more and some specific details regarding the requirements for the POS systems, you can, of course, subscribe to our fiscal portal and check out our Norwegian page on our portal, and maybe book a workshop with us. Who knows?
I would say that you don't need me as a host at all.
Sorry if I
No, you were
took
great.
your
Thank you
part.
so much.
Yeah.
There is always something more. it's like a circle that doesn't stop, I would say, when it comes to fiscalization and fiscal systems and types of transactions and certification processes. There's always something more, always something extra add on. So this is really really significant for us, and thank you for giving us all this information for free. So it was really great. You did a great job. So everyone, Stefan Ditrih once again. We were talking about the types of fiscal transactions in Norway. And thank you, Stefan, once again for being here with us, for your time, for giving us the answers, for telling us more about the fiscal transactions in Norway. And thanks everyone for watching once again. Of course, Stefan already told you, if you have any other questions, go and check out our fiscal portal because we update it daily. So that's it for now. And until next time, bye.